I'm Lawrence Francis, host of Interpreting Wine, where today we feature the first talk at the recent Real Wine Fair 2024. This is a panel discussion covering the mighty topic, A Question of Taste, and features author Alice Feiring, Doug Wregg of Le Cave de Pyrene, hosted by Christina Pickard of Wine Enthusiast. I love being able to share this talk with those of you who couldn't make it. Maybe you weren't at the Real Wine Fair this year, or if you were tasting or pouring during the talk. I really hope this episode means you can involve yourself in the topic of just what is taste. In a wide-ranging discussion, we first hear Doug Wregg and Alice Feiring on good taste and tasting notes, before Alice discusses the wider points rating system and describes her very own 8-point system, before Doug breaks down how to assess a wine. Alice shares her recollections on losing her sense of taste in the pandemic, leading to Doug sharing his own reflections on 2020, before a tasting of 2 wines, which give the panel an opportunity to describe the wines in their very own words. First, tasting the summer Wolff Ette Vino Bianco, before bringing in the La Stoppa Macchiona. We close out with Doug answering the thorny question of does all natural wine taste the same? And Alice's reflections and views on wine education. Enjoy.
My name is Christina Pickard. I work with Le Cave de Pyrene and also write for Wine Enthusiast, a magazine in the States, and cover wines there for them, various beats, and taste very traditionally in terms of the way that we score wines and review wines. So I think I'm an interesting person to moderate this panel. But we have with us today, if you don't know them already, Doug Wregg and Alice Feiring. Doug, of course, is the sales and marketing director at Le Cave, has been really instrumental over decades now, almost, in really bringing natural wine to the consciousness of UK wine drinkers particularly. And of course, Le Cave, as you may already know, has been behind some really quite iconic wine bars here in the UK that really kind of launched many of the natural wine bars and shops and things that we love today. And Terroir really being the first one, rest in peace. But that was really the first natural wine bar in London, and certainly the first one to bring a lot of these wines into the consciousness of English drinkers. And Doug is a prolific and wonderful writer. I highly recommend you go check out the Le Cave de Pyrene blog. He's still at it. We just passed 1,000 blogs, didn't we, Doug? So impressive. And he has a really unique way of talking about wine and tasting wine, which we're going to get into in a minute. And then, of course, we have Alice Feiring, who I also feel like doesn't need much introduction for you natural wine fans, but Alice has kind of done very similar things and had very similar influence on the wine world in the States, and has been writing about wine for 25 years almost, right? About 25 years, was one of the first people in the States to start talking about what we put into wines and what conventional producers were adding to wines or not adding or manipulating. She was really the first person to kickstart that conversation and caused a tsunami because of it, and has written 6 books. 6 books. Her latest one is available in the Real Wine shop, and it is, I always forget the name because it's got, you have a lot of love in your titles.
I love them. To Fall in Love, Drink This.
Fall in Love.
And it's newly available in the UK, even though it was out in the States for a year and a half. And it's a memoir.
It's really wonderful. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It really weaves in Alice's life, which is fascinating, with her natural wine recommendations. So highly recommend you grab that in the shop. So the topic for today, as we've already touched upon a little bit, it's quite a big overarching topic, and I'm excited to dive in and go down a few rabbit holes with you both. But we have titled it A Question of Taste. And so I think the idea with today is just to examine this conventional framework of tasting that we have as wine tasters. This fairly scientific and analytical way of tasting, and just sort of question, is that fit for us within natural wine and just within the wine world in general? Are there more interesting, more intuitive ways of tasting? So first of all, I just want to throw out to you, I'm just curious because I know today is a day for both trade and consumers. How many of you work in the wine trade? Okay, maybe like 50%. And of those of you who work in the wine trade, how many of you talk about tasting wine, whether it be writing wine reviews or communicating the taste of wine to customers? How many of you do that on a pretty regular basis? Okay, that's just good for me to know. Because I think at the end of this, we're going to have a little Q&A, but I want to throw it out to you, like I said, and get an idea of how you might describe these wines in your glass. And we'll see if anything changes from maybe what you're thinking about them now to the way that you might think about them in the end. Just to throw it to Doug and Alice, I'm curious to know, what is good taste? First of all, according to the traditional wine hierarchy, how would you talk about the traditional way of what we consider taste to be when it comes to wine? I'm just throwing it to both of you.
Good taste. Good taste is what I like, but okay, that's not really the question. That's what the answer will be in the finish, I suspect. Good taste is what is agreed by the majority of critics to have value. That value being value in terms of the what you can charge for the wine, but also, I suppose, the aesthetic value when you taste it. There are sort of certain qualities within wines which are sort of more, if not universally recognized, widely recognized, that these are good things to have. And I suppose traditionally, tastes have changed over the decades, the centuries even, but structure is like always valued. A wine that has ageability is valued over a wine that has drinkability, for example. A wine that has architecture, like big bone structure, is valued over a wine which is perhaps sinewy and energetic. So old-fashioned values value sort of, I think it's like squareness. If I had to describe a shape, natural wine taste, or those who love natural wines, like completely different qualities. They like fluidity, movement, dynamism, tension. These words, this vocabulary is hardly ever used when you are like sitting on panels and having to taste wine. One little anecdote, because I always like telling this against myself. I'm rarely invited, or I'm not now invited at all, onto big tasting panels, but I was for a few years invited on the Decanter World Wine Awards. Decanter, a big wine magazine, and the various panels are usually juries of 4 from the trade, sommeliers, wine buyers, journalists, sit down and assess like a bunch of wines. Usually each panel will taste about 120 in a day, which is very dispiriting. And but you taste in flights of 10. In the old days, you would have to write religiously tasting notes for each wine and then give it a mark out of, let's say, 20. I sort of go prepared with like classic tasting notes, like wine's all the fruits of the forest and all the sort of, veg in the greengrocers. And I pretty well exhaust all my fruits and veg after about 2 or 3 wines. So sort of plug them into the wines. It's a sort of meaningless tasting note, but so many tasting notes classically and traditionally are meaningless because, wine never tastes of wine. It always tastes of something else, doesn't it? But never tastes of grapes, obviously. Anyway, so I exhausted that. And then I was just putting ticks and crosses, mainly crosses, because I didn't really like the wines. And then the late, great Stephen Spurrier, who was a super juror, as they're called, sat down at our table and said, I'd like to take all your individual notes for each of the wines. And I thought, oh no. I didn't say oh no, but I said something far ruder. Anyway, so he went around and everybody who's like what I call a classically trained wine and spirits education trust student was reciting these beautifully written, grammatically correct tasting notes about the wines. And I thought, I don't actually recognize the descriptions, but they're so well written. And he was nodding like the sage approval. Yeah, excellent. And went round, and then he said, Douglas, wine number 5. I looked down and I've written cross. And the thing is, I couldn't actually remember whether it was a red or white wine that I tasted. So I had no reference. And I thought, I'm going to have to improvise. So I improvised a tasting note which said, like, clean appearance, sort of like good fruit on the nose, moderate length on the palate, etc., like what I call an ecumenical tasting note. It was absolutely meaningless. He looked at me and said, what an excellent tasting note. We'll use that one for the decanter thing. And I felt like I could have said anything. Tasting notes are pointless. And actually, assessment is pretty pointless because it didn't say whether I liked the wine or disliked the wine. It didn't say anything about the wine, but pretty well everyone's tasting notes was of a style that you're instructed to do to sort of get to the heart of the wine. But didn't even get to the surface of the wine, let alone the heart of it. Anyway, I tell that against myself, but I also say that, in a way, tasting notes and marking, which I'm sure we'll get on to momentarily, are a bit bogus.
So the reason that I quickly passed over the microphone to Doug is that the notion of, I actually don't know what normal people do when they look at a wine because it seems completely irrelevant to me. And I think it always has. I remember when I got my first book to write in 2000, it was a wine guide for Food and Wine magazine. Mary Mulligan, who ran the WSET MW preparation course in the United States, in New York, said, you really need to learn how to do proper tasting notes. And she said, just sit in. And they seem so completely irrelevant to me because, yes, you note the color and the clarity, but really, what does that mean as far as quality? And even back in 2000, it seemed meaningless. So I think I quickly, because I'm a really terrible student, and I always have been, dyslexia probably factored into that, I always charted my own way into a tasting note. But also, I started learning about wine in the late 70s, and so my taste was cut on those early classic wines. And I do remember being in Burgundy a lot and seeing how wines that I probably could have put in that classic good wine, how now when I sit down to them at friends of mine when I'm in Burgundy, and I, push the Meunier away, and they're not interesting to me. They're dead and lifeless. So right now I actually couldn't tell you what a classic good wine is, because I probably would disagree totally with the mainstream.
That's interesting, and coming from, I know I'm the moderator, but I'm going to put my 2 cents in here as well. Because I probably am, maybe of the three of us, the only one that sort of every day is kind of very much in a traditional structure of reviewing. For Wine Enthusiast, we have a buying guide. I review thousands of wines a year within a very traditional 100-point system. Sometimes in the wine industry, those of you who work in it know, there's also the 20-point system. And we are, and if you do what we call the WSETs, Wine and Spirits Education Trust, it's, we are taught very much to break wines down by appearance, by aroma, by taste. It gets as specific as being, having to say, is this light, medium, light-bodied, it was even broken down within the body. It's been a lot of years since, but it gets very, very specific into these technicals. And I do remember at the time doing the WSETs going, what does it matter, actually, if a wine is the light side of light-bodied or the medium side of light-bodied? Really, what does that matter? And it felt a little pointless. But that being said, I also in the States, and Alice, I don't know if you've seen this, saw, especially with natural wine now becoming, dare we say, mainstream over the years, having worked in it for a long time now, I saw also a sort of departure away from any kind of useful tasting note where there was certain reviewers in the States who were like, oh, it tastes like my summer vacation, with the sand between my toes and my bathing suit, and it was like, well, that's entertaining, but it's actually told me nothing about the wine. So to me, that's the extreme other end of what I'm doing, which is this very technical side. And then that side, which is going, well, you've entertained me, but you haven't actually helped me to understand what I may expect from the wine. So now I feel like we're in this really interesting time where I think that we can find somewhere in between that. And for me, having kind of had this journey where I was natural wine into a more conventional style of tasting, it did force me to become a better taster and a more technical taster. But are there things that I would love to change about the way that I taste at Wine Enthusiast? Absolutely. And I want to talk to you guys about the point system in a minute. But the points, I always feel like I wish I had 3 different points to be able to give out. 1 point for the technicals, 1 point for how the wine made me feel, and maybe another point for when I would want to drink that wine. Was this at this very moment in time the wine I wanted to drink? So there are so many limitations within that as well. And I think that's what I'm hoping to sort of get at with this is where is that middle ground? Yes, there is some technicals are good, and also we just go so far into that where we have this sort of shopping list, as Doug said, of aromas and flavors that are really based off of a handful, maybe a couple dozen noble vinifera varieties. That's, if you're here tomorrow, come to the hybrids discussion. We're going to talk more about that. But we are kind of straitjacketed into quite a tight list of vocabulary. What about the point system for you guys? How do you feel about points, and is that something that is useful to you in your tasting, or not so much?
Well, having written my first book, The Battle for Wine and Love, or How I Saved the World from Parkerization, the person who really championed the 100-point system, it's meaningless. You just do not put a point system on an aesthetic. But was it in 2016, 2017, I was asked to organize a natural wine competition for Vin Italy. Now, the notion of a wine competition is something that's heinous to me. I don't believe in it. But I knew if somebody else did it, it'd be worse. So I agreed to do it for 2 years. And I said I would not do a point system. And so what I did was I developed an 8-point evaluation for my judges to look at a wine. And I haven't really thought about that for a few years, so I wrote them down. And this was actually inspired by, there was one time I was at a tasting and somebody who was an NW student asked me whether they could follow me during the tasting. I said, sure. And then after a few stops, she said to me, do you taste first for faults? And I laughed, and I said, no, I taste first for pleasure. And the idea of actually judging first for faults, and that seemed, I laughed because it seemed so ludicrous. Don't we all just taste first for pleasure? So my first of my 8 qualities was an emotional impact, whether any kind of emotional impact, whether you hate it or you love it or you were, like raise an eyebrow, but what was the emotion when you first approached the wine? The other one was technical, is it balanced? The other one, does it have liveliness? Does it evolve in the glass? And I think this is something that would never pass in a classical way of looking at a wine, because I think that would be a negative, not a positive. Does it have a drinkability? Does it feel good? Does it have savory quality? For me, this is really a very important element because we put so much emphasis on the fruit. But for me, a really great wine will always have a little bit of bitter, a little bit of savory, or maybe a lot, but it's an extremely important element in a wine for complexity. Transparency, is it being honest with you? And the other one is, does it have a sense of place? And not necessarily a sense of terroir, because you may not know, but does it want you to go wherever that wine was? Does it want you to know about it? For me, that is an extension of terroir. And I figured if you have 5 of these qualities, you have a really good wine. If you have over 6, you have a really good wine. And I still abide by these. I don't think I'd really tweak it very much. And so, I would rather have, at least in a tasting note, that addressed. Even, of course, it was reduced to points anyway, but...
Can you read those again, Alice? Because I think that's so good for people to know. I want to write that down, too. So her 8-point system.
Emotional impact, balance, liveliness, evolution in the glass, drinkability. It could also be called digestibility, savory, transparency, and a sense of place.
I love that.
Well, I'm not going to add to that particularly. I think if everything is right about the wine and the stars are aligned, and most important, if you're in the mood, receptive mood, and I mean open-minded and open-hearted, then you're on your way to a wine epiphany, which is something I'm trying to write a book about, is that sort of blinding flash where you sort of fall in love with wine. You actually sort of fall in love with almost like yourself and nature and everything around you. Wine has the ability to transport you, and that to me is it's all the unknowable things that happen when you're tasting. So when Alice said emotional impact, that's really important to me because I don't analyze from the beginning. I know whether I like it or not, or love it or not, and then maybe retrospectively I start to unpick why I love it. But I don't want to deconstruct the wine. The wine is whole and wholesome, and I'm not the right person to sort of put it into little boxes and try to make it less than it actually is. It's the whole impact I'm looking at, not just the sort of little bits that make up the whole. But sometimes I'll notice the little bits, and sometimes I'll notice the tension or the savory quality or the bitterness or the minerality. And because it's something I enjoy tasting, I really enjoy these little elements within the wine, but it's not the whole experience that's really blowing me out of the water. When Alice said liveliness, I would say my philosophy of natural wine, I don't have a philosophy or a real wine, is the wine alive? Is the wine a living thing? And I just know when it is, and I know when it isn't. And that's why it's difficult to put measurements on stuff or marks on stuff. I put a wine in my mouth, and if I want to swirl it around or drink it or swallow it, that's the main thing. Everything else is almost irrelevant. But so many wines out there are confected, have been neutralized by technique. And I regard technique, really clumsy technique, as a kind of fault. So this is the antithesis of what you're taught at WSET, is how well made is the wine. And I like to think that the wine isn't unmade by sort of over elaborated technique. I also like to think that, the winemaker they sometimes call him or her the midwife, but also like a cook. And when you're making wine, you should be tasting along the way, but not using the recipe, religiously. You do what the wine needs, but you don't add things for the sake of adding them just because you've been taught to at school. It's like life itself. So I think a lot of vignerons end up, making natural wines because ultimately, what do you want to do? You want to make wines that you yourself would drink. And I've noticed an evolution in a lot of people out there as they started off on the more sort of conventional path, but they opened a bottle of their wine and they couldn't actually drink it. So why wouldn't you make a wine that has the qualities that Alice's proposed? And I think they're absolutely bang on,
Absolutely. Just pivoting a little bit, I'm curious to talk to you both about your experience during COVID, because last time we were together, well, Doug and I, you were in Austria at the time, so 2 years ago, the fair, almost exactly 2 years ago, Doug and I both got COVID from the fair, of course, it was pretty inevitable. And Alice, we found out at the time, was in Austria and had COVID as well. So we were messaging a little bit, and you were pretty panicky, rightfully so, having lost your sense of taste and smell. I only lost my sense of taste for about 24 hours, so I was very lucky, but Doug, you also lost yours for a bit, too?
Not badly.
Okay.
No.
Well, I guess I'm just curious to know what that experience was like for you as professional wine tasters, and what, in that sort of very scary period as professionals, what it was like to know that you could lose it, then when it finally came to pass, what kind of was going through your head, and did you find other ways to enjoy wine without those senses?
Well, I was definitely in a panic. I was coming back from Character, and coming back from Christian Cheetahs, and I'm not feeling that well. And his Julia, who works with him, was taking me to get tested on the way to the airport. They come running after me, and I knew it. And they said, "No, you have to take a PCR." Right? Okay.
Back in the day.
Back in the day, it was about a week before you could fly without having a test. And I decided, this was really bad of me, but I was just going to test until I got a false negative. And I got on that plane and I got home. And that night, it started where everything started to taste super salty. And I have a very, very salty palate. I mean, I love salt. But everything started, and I this is not good. Started going through my spice cabinet, and are all my spices dead? I just immediately went into nose training, even before I lost it. I went to the mint on my fire escape. I was shoving mint up my nostrils and citrus rinds, and it was a really interesting thing. I was that way for 3 days. I did drink through it, but I was drinking mostly spirits, taking it medicinally, of course. But I was also tasting to see, what, my house wine, what I knew what it was supposed to taste like and what was it like, and trying to envision if it never came back, because I know of certain wine professionals, pretty high profile, that it still hasn't come back, whether there was a workaround. I mean, I knew what the wine was supposed to be like. Well, could I still taste structure? I think in some ways, the aromatics of a wine are the least important, even though it certainly is enjoyable. But because that's always going to be changing dramatically after the first year, the fresh fruitiness changes into something else. But I could still taste structure and acid. And so would I be able to, thank goodness I'm not a critic, so it wasn't that essential, but I was starting to prepare myself for the inevitability. It did come back, and what was really interesting, when it came back, it came roaring back. Once everything was in place, I felt almost psychotically sensitive in my sense of smell and taste. This happened to me one time before in my life, and it was extremely peculiar. But it was terrifying, but I did go through this thing. Okay, this isn't the worst thing in the world, right? I will be able to survive it, but completely delighted that I didn't. One thing that I did, if anybody, that I think was really important, I got nasal propolis, a spray of propolis that I shot up my nose twice a day. I think it really helped. Anyway.
Well, perversely, generally, in 2020, it was probably the year I felt healthiest. And I've never appreciated wine so much as in 2020, but it's a psychological thing of having the opportunity to have a relationship with a bottle, which lasted all day. I spent so much time outside on my balcony, my south-facing balcony. And the weather, if you're in this country in 2020, it was a glorious time. Not people suffering from COVID, but just the weather was amazing. There's peace and quiet outside. You could hear birdsong. And I fell in love deeply, again, with orange wines. There's something about drinking an orange wine outside with the sun shining it on it, and it captures the light in a unique way. And the anticipation, you almost want to sort of like refuse to drink it, just to look at it and enjoy the pleasure. I got more pleasure. I was more sensitive to colour and to feeling about wine, but also I really fell in love with the texture. I wanted to keep the wine in my mouth, not just swallow it. And so I think it was like quite a hedonistic experience but I don't normally have that. I'm normally at the end of the day, I'm really tired, and like I've got some food. I just want to like drink wine and relax. This time it was like I was going to enjoy the whole day. I was going to squeeze every ounce of sunshine and pleasure out of a bottle of wine. And I'm lucky that I didn't get COVID then. Funny enough, I only got COVID when I had my vaccination, after I had my vaccination. And then it was like, well, it was a mild form, just like flu. So like when I have flu, of course, we all lose our sense of taste or our interest in wine and food. And then when it comes back, as Alice says, it comes roaring back and everything is really exciting and you're super sensitized almost to flavor. And that's quite good. It's actually, sometimes I wonder if it's nature's way of saying, like, you need to let up on the wine tasting. And actually, I now, occasionally, I hope for, like, to get flu or a cold, so I can take a month off or 2 weeks off, and then I come back so much better as a taster and so much more loving wine. Because in the end, if it's your life, you can become jaded. I mean, you know, I now drink beer and gin and tonic just to sort of, like, give myself a break.
About the time during COVID, something very strange did happen in the spring of 2020, and it actually was the basis of the memoir. It's the last essay in the book, that I craved oxidative wines. Absolutely craved oxidative wines. I needed sherry, I needed anything with the floor on it, please. I remember once, because the shops were open in New York, a friend of mine who was in charge of a Spanish wine shop brought me an emergency magnum of Barbadillo. It was just like, thank you. And it was only, so the book was based on drinking alone during COVID, but that was an essay that was published early on. So I had all this wine because my boyfriend is terrible hypochondriac, and so he refused to be with me during COVID. So I had all this wine. It started there, but afterwards I started thinking about the symbolism of needing oxidative wines at a time when people were dying of lack of oxygen. And it's one of those things as a writer, then you put down on a page and the symbolism kind of shocks you because you hadn't actually thought about it at the time.
I'm going to put you both on the spot a little bit and ask you to talk about the wine in your glass, and maybe everybody else, if you still have any left, can just have a think about it as well. I think it'd just be fun, since we all have the same wine in our glasses, and we can do the same for the red in a minute. And then also, Doug, maybe you can give us just a little bit of info about the wine too, but just to have you guys taste and talk in your own words how you would describe this wine. So first of all, Doug, can you let us know what's in the glass?
What's in this glass is a wine that I've not tasted till this very second. It's a very rare grape called Baratucciat, and it's native to not even Piedmont, but a specific valley in Piedmont. And there's about 6 growers who have making a tiny amount of it. It was grown, I think, in the 19th century, but pretty well disappeared anyway. And a few people are sort of bringing it back and experimenting with it. And this is Summer Wolff's Baratucciat, which he calls Ette, 100% of this grape. Her husband also makes the version, and he also blends it in with other grapes. I think it's a really late harvest, or late ripening grape, as far as I can remember, end of October. So Alice and I were commenting on the fact, although this looks like a skin contact wine,
it has 9 days.
It does have, yeah. Okay, it does have, okay.
It looks like one and it is one.
Okay, thank goodness. Okay, I was about to give you, right? Yes, thank God for that. So, interesting fact, the Baratucciat means cat's testicles even, so apparently the shapes of the grape, you would have thought most of the shapes of the grape look like cat's testicles, but obviously this looks even more like cat's testicles than whatever. So I just wanted just a quick rabbit hole, or cat hole, to disappear it down. I'm writing this book on taste, or whatever, and one of the things is when you do the WSET course, the thing they skip over is sight. The way when you look at wine, but actually I submit, I think it may be controversial, is that it's much more important than your sense of smell and your sense of taste, because tasting is 90% in your brain. You can be programmed to taste something that's not there. And I was going to originally be very playful and bring a white wine and put some ink in it, like a sort of edible ink, and asked you for your tasting notes, and if you didn't give me red berry tasting notes, I would have been very surprised. It's a psychological thing, and they've done it with food, food colorings. Many chefs play with your brain, and you can do that with wine. I could have done it with a drop of Saperavi in a Riesling, and you would have probably thought it was a Saperavi rather than a Riesling, even though it was 99% Riesling. So when you're instructed in the WSET originally, I don't know whether it's still the case, it's like clarity is really important. So it's like cleanness. Cleanness is a sign of healthiness. Now, I don't agree. I think density of color, I think shininess, but real shininess, not artificial. I think a wine which is unfiltered is more interesting. But I think there's a vogue for like clinically correct wines. And a short anecdote, I went to London Wine Fair one, the stand, because I saw this white wine. It was a Pinot Grigio, and it was just out on the table. And I said, "What is that?" He said, "Pinot Grigio." I said, "No, I know what it is." I said, "What is that colour?" And they said, "It's a white wine." I said, "No, it's not. It's electric blue." I said, "How do you get it like that?" I said, "We thrice filter it." And I said, that's not wine, though, is it? Like, it's a horrible, unnatural colour. Electric blue in nature, and these are sort of colours of nature, I think. And and for me, like a wine which looks appetizing. Then I want to smell it. I want to dive in. Then I want to put it in my mouth. But wine which is like, the colour of water, is like, well, I'd rather have water than that. So I don't mind bits floating around. I don't mind turbidity. And I think now hopefully things have changed, that we don't look at cleanness and filtered wine, but we look at the quality of the colour. And the quality of colour comes from within, not from just the light. It's something, and when you taste it, it's the energy that's sort of vibrating in the wine that you're looking at. And then, smell, of course, is important, but human beings are not very sensitive to animals anymore, or, sort of hunt our food. And most of us live in cities where we don't really want to be smelling what's going around, particularly in New York, I have to say. And our taste is, of course, linked to our sense of smell. But again, it's almost like the vocabulary in taste comes first, and then we sort of find the right words, and then we put it into the wine. So, I've been doing a lot of research into the neuropsychological side of tasting. That's a very deep rabbit hole, and you begin to wonder whether anything is the way it really is, or whether your memory or your mind is constantly playing tricks.
I think Alice, if you can maybe talk us through this wine and tell us how you would talk about it and describe it, that'd be great.
I don't know if you've noticed it, because I keep on drinking it. The way every sip is different for me. So this really, I think the first time that I had this, the only other time before, was at a tasting in Richmond, Virginia, and I was charmed by it. It kept on hitting me in different angles. It has a really nice texture that keeps on bringing me back. I do like the touch of volatility on it. I like it's all raised in concrete, which is something that I really appreciate a great deal. It has a lovely texture of beginning, middle, and end, but it is really, what is the most important thing to me about this wine is that it feels good and it makes me smile. I do like it's kind of like a little orange peel kind of thing, even though I hate when it's a skin contact wine when orange is in there, because it's so confusing. It is in there. But it is in there. And that I tasted blind, I like where I would be confused a little bit, and I would definitely want to know where it was from. So I don't know, it doesn't really speak Monferrato to me, where this is from. Monferrato is south of Asti, about an hour out of Torino. But the most important thing to me about this wine is the liveliness and the transparency. It is very much a wine of what it says it is.
I think, Doug, do you want to just tell everybody what's in their glass? Because this one, if you hadn't sort of caught on, even just by the color, and I have quite a bit of sediment in there as well, it has a bit of bottle age, this one. Can you tell us what's in the glass, Doug?
Okay. So this is a wine called Macchiona, and it's from Emilia-Romagna, and it's from the stable of Elena Pantaleoni from La Stoppa. It's come from a place called Rivergaro, and it's a blend of Bernarda and Barbera. They're often found together in Emilia-Romagna, and it's a hot region, and these are big, bold wines, and yet there's always, even in the hottest vintages, this is 2006, by the way, there's always a freshness that underpins them. So you think you're going to have a big mouthful of wow, heaviness, but actually the wines are pretty relaxed. And actually I've noticed in the last probably 4 or 5 vintages, getting fresher and fresher and almost more and more delightful and floral. And I think that's often to do with the confidence of the winemaking. It's like the person's sort of like a winemaker, you know, their personality is almost invariably revealed in the wine and what they like to drink. And I think there's a trend now, particularly with natural wines, is to drink sort of wines which seem to be effortlessly, you know, sort of seamlessly drinkable, beautiful. Beauty is something we all value. It's not something we talk about in tasting notes in wine. And this is more of a harking back to the past, but there's still something rather wonderful about it. I mean, you know, I would love to just drink, you know, I don't know, D'Amour Chablis and like great Jura whites, but occasionally I drink an old Rioja. So, because it's comforting, it's warming, it's earthy and spicy, and, you know, it has... I mentioned secondary aromatics. I mean, we're beginning to get real development. I mean, you can tell from the colour, obviously. This is when it's younger, and I think in the shop they're selling 2016, and you know it's opaque. It could do. You can drink anything young if you like the crunch of tannins and you know whatever. And I do actually. I prefer young wines to old wines, but I appreciate old wines like this. You know, there's wisdom in age, and you know, I feel that there's a lot going on in this, and I can just nose it around and you know, like appreciate it in a sort of what they call like meditation wine. You know, it's a wine to sip and to think about, and then not to think about, and then to come back again.
Now, I chose this wine because right now everybody wants to drink Jura. Light, crunchy reds, and wines like this have a hard time in at least the natural wine market, even though it's like totally the best of natural wine aesthetic going on here. And I remember Elena telling me, people want me to make a lighter wine, but I don't want to. I want to make these wines of structure. And I visited, around the first time that I visited, she took me to see Lino Maga from Barbacalou. And she said, you need to understand Lino's wines to understand what I'm doing. And it is such a traditional Italian wine. And what Elena and La Stoppa is doing is really carrying on that same kind of deep-aged, beautiful, structured tradition. And in some ways, with just the knock it back late, just keep on drinking until 3 o'clock in the morning, this is not what you're going to do. But the beauty of a wine like this, I feel, is presently getting lost, and it's one reason I wanted to bring it. Just remember, it's still here. It gives you another part of the picture.
It's been an interesting pendulum swing, hasn't it? Because I think because of a lot of Parker, big Parker Point wines that we went through this period in sort of the early 2000s, late 90s, of the bigger the better, the more high octane, the higher the alcohol, the more extracted, the more tannic. It was good because it was going to get 100 points from Parker, and that was, you know, the ultimate goal. And then I feel like we've kind of swung into this, like, now the lighter the better, the crunchier the better, like chilled reds, knock them back. And I think there's certainly a place for those. And now I hope we're kind of swinging back a little bit more towards saying it's okay to actually have some structure. It's just they don't need to be 16% alcohol. Like, it's okay. We can still have structure in our red wines, and we can still drink them a little closer to room temperature, and they can age. It's okay to have some wines that we can cellar. So it's interesting to see how it swings back and forth, but hopefully somewhere in between. I hope we don't go all the way back to the Parker wines of the 90s.
I mean, but also, if you ever, the journalist who had a big thing about natural wine, a big thing against natural wine, would say, all natural wines taste the same. Well, I mean, there's 1,000 wines out there, and not even all growers' wines taste the same as each other. Not every vintage is different, but also growers are people, they evolve. And yes, there has been a fad. There are fads, there'll always be fads, but there's a massive spectrum of styles, and you like some or others. Or I'm quite Catholic. In terms of natural wines, it's my mood that determines what I like, not the wines themselves. So I choose the wine to fit my mood. And was it Pascaline who said, tell me who you are, and I'll find a natural wine to fit your personality. I do feel like that. The spectrum in natural wine actually is wider than in conventional wine, because conventional wines are made to a style to be commercially appealing and to appeal to supermarket buyers or critics who have now retired. Whereas natural wines are, they're the personality of the people and the personality of the terroir and the personality of the vintage and experimentation or tradition and all these things sort of under one roof, basically.
All the wine education is based on a classic way of tasting. I think knowing the basics of regions, grapes, laws, all that stuff is great. But the actual practical, for me, is completely irrelevant. All it means, what is a typical Sancerre? What does a Sauvignon Blanc taste like? As soon as you do a no-sulfur Sauvignon Blanc, you're breaking that model. So it is very much a system that feeds into the commercial wine world that is selling bottles. And I think you don't have to throw everything out, but the whole tasting part has got to be revamped to be relevant in today's world. Because like it or not, natural wine has broken the system. It has created way more diversity. There's no way that you can really talk about typicity. You could talk about an old-fashioned typicity. This is the way it used to be like when everything was yeasted and filtered and blah, 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 which is important to know. But is also know what does a wine that is made with serious élevage, serious farming, same grape, how does that perform differently? And so what if you just can't put it in the same box and can't quantify it? It's important to know that.
A massive thanks to today's guests for agreeing to be recorded during your talk. That's author Alice Feiring, Doug Wregg of Le Cave de Pyrene, and Christina Pickard of Wine Enthusiast. If you've heard this today and you've got any questions or follow-up, why not reach out to the panel, all of whom are very active on social media. Let them know what you thought of the episode, and of course that you heard them on Interpreting Wine. Do be sure to visit the link below, which is therealwinefair.com, where you can learn more information about the fair, and when the time comes, register for tickets. Thanks so much to all the listeners who saw me at the Real Wine Fair, came and said hi, and all the amazing producers who, for me, again underline why this is such a special fair. And I highly recommend, if you haven't got there yet, to go and give the Real Wine Fair a look when it returns. See you soon.